What if one tiny waterway could crash the global economy? 20 million barrels of oil move through a narrow passage in the Persian Gulf every single day. That passage is the Strait of Hormuz. At its narrowest point, it is only about 30 miles wide. In early 2026, tanker traffic through that corridor suddenly dropped as tensions escalated between Iran and Western naval forces. Within days, the price of Brent crude oil jumped sharply. In the United States, gasoline moved from the mid-$2.90 per gallon to over $3.40, and in some weeks even approaching $3.50, almost overnight. To markets, this is called volatility. To households, it feels like something else entirely. It feels like a tax. Not voted on, not legislated, just absorbed. But who actually pays it? Consider a typical 35-year-old warehouse supervisor in the United States. After taxes, he brings home around $4,200 a month. His fixed expenses are ordinary: $1,400 for rent, $400 for groceries, $250 for transportation, utilities, insurance, and minimum debt payments. After all that, maybe a few $100s remain for savings. Now fuel prices jump 15 to 20%. That adds roughly $60 to $80 a month to commuting and errands. It doesn't sound catastrophic, but the budget was already tight. So the trade-offs begin. Groceries shrink. Car maintenance gets delayed. Emergency savings get thinner. The problem is not laziness or bad budgeting. The problem is that a geopolitical choke point 10,000 miles away just rewrote his household math, and he has absolutely no way to hedge against it. Now look at the other side of the ledger. In 2025, ExxonMobil reported $28.8 billion in annual profit. Operational cash flow reached roughly $52 billion. Production levels hit record highs as higher prices boosted margins during supply disruptions. Scale matters in this industry. The revenues of a single oil major can rival the GDP of smaller nations. When global supply tightens, companies operating at that scale often capture enormous windfalls, not necessarily by producing more oil, but simply because the price environment shifts in their favor. Zoom out further. The global oil system is not evenly distributed. The United States alone now accounts for roughly 20% of global liquids production, thanks to shale output. Meanwhile, most of the world's spare production capacity sits with only a few producers, primarily Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Together, they control several million barrels per day of capacity that can be activated when markets tighten. Even drilling activity reflects this discipline. The Baker Hughes rig count in early 2026 showed roughly 411 active U.S. oil rigs, enough to expand production when prices justify it, but restrained enough to protect margins. In other words, when volatility appears, the system is already positioned to monetize it. Economists sometimes call this geopolitical rent, not profit created through additional productivity, but value captured because the system itself contains bottlenecks. And the Strait of Hormuz is the largest bottleneck in the global energy network. Nearly a fifth of the world's oil must pass through it every day. Imagine the global economy as a highway. Now imagine that highway suddenly narrowing to a single bridge. Anyone who controls traffic near that bridge, physically or financially, gains leverage. And this pattern isn't limited to energy. In housing, large institutional landlords concentrate ownership and pass rising costs to renters. In food supply, a handful of processors and retailers capture margins during input shocks. In banking, derivatives desks price tail risk and collect premiums. In technology platforms, dominant intermediaries take a percentage of nearly every transaction. Different industries, same structure. Volatility concentrates gains upstream while diffusing costs downstream. This architecture did not appear overnight. The modern oil market took shape after the 1973 oil crisis reshaped energy geopolitics. Energy security became a strategic priority. Financial markets began pricing geopolitical risk into every barrel traded. Insurance markets followed. At Lloyd's of London, war risk insurance policies began assigning explicit premiums to tanker shipments through conflict zones. Those premiums fluctuate with political tension, but they rarely disappear entirely. Even when the waterway stays open, the possibility that it might close becomes part of the price. This is the Hormuz Premium, a structural surcharge embedded into the global energy system. Analysts estimate that the persistent risk premium tied to this choke point often ranges between a few dollars per barrel in calm periods and $10 to $18 during heightened tensions. Multiply that by global oil consumption, and the number becomes enormous. The premium does not appear as a single line item on a fuel receipt. Instead, it diffuses across the economy. Higher transport costs, more expensive food, rising logistics fees, reduced purchasing power. Millions of small impacts accumulating into a massive transfer of wealth. Yet, the system also has defenders. Energy firms argue that oil extraction is capital-intensive and cyclical. During oversupply periods, profit margins can collapse. Risk premiums help justify investment in infrastructure that reduces vulnerability, such as bypass pipelines or alternative export routes. Governments make a similar argument. Maintaining naval deterrence in strategic waterways helps prevent conflicts that would impose far greater economic damage. In that view, the premium is not exploitation, it is insurance, a price paid to prevent something worse. But the deeper question remains, what is the real risk here? Is it the periodic threat that the Strait of Hormuz might close? Or is it the fact that modern civilization depends so heavily on a single point of failure? Because when the world's energy supply must pass through a narrow maritime corridor, tension itself becomes a commodity. A threat becomes a price signal, and uncertainty becomes profitable. Picture a narrow bridge carrying the daily fuel supply of the global economy. One side occasionally threatens to block it. Another side patrols to keep it open. Meanwhile, everyone else quietly pays the toll to ensure the traffic keeps moving. That is the equilibrium, a repeated geopolitical game where the side payment is the risk premium itself. The immediate crisis may pass. Tanker traffic will normalize. Markets will stabilize. But the underlying architecture, the system that converts geopolitical tension into economic revenue, rarely disappears. In structures built on the ability to impose costs without bearing them, the bill always arrives somewhere else, often far away, often quietly, and almost always in the budgets of people who never knew the toll existed.